As you know, I teach in the journalism school, and journalists are participating very actively on social media these days, and particularly on Twitter, which is kind of the water cooler for the industry. So in that context, microlearning makes a ton of sense because it really allows students to do something that they would be doing professionally anyway, and integrates it into the classroom. I think it's really important to do these kind of microlearning tasks sometimes on a public platform like this, because it changes the way in which we think about learning and information. Because it's a kind of public performance, as opposed to just sort of an isolated task, we really have to think socially about how we're going to convey information, and how an audience outside of our head might perceive that information. And so when the students post these things and share these things on social media, I think it demands different cognitive tasks than if it were just, as I said, in isolation. I mean, another main learning objective in a media classroom is this idea of compression of information, the ability to quickly sort of synthesize and distill the essence of what's important in something. And because of the, in some ways, artificial parameters of most social media platforms, it does have a kind of, it demands a kind of rigor in terms of compression. And so I think social media, in that way really actually aids learning. I know, it's often criticized for the superficiality of it, but you could also flip that on its head and say, well, no, it really demands students to distill things to their essence, and to think about what sort of, how do ideas, words, images, memes travel socially, as opposed to in isolation. So I mean, one thing that we have to recognize with millennials and the kind of digitally native generation is that they don't necessarily distinguish between offline and online in terms of their lives, the way they live their lives. And so they are very used to having conversations, both serious and frivolous, in social media space. And I think, increasingly, I think educators need to recognize that. One concern is, of course, sort of notions of privacy, notions that the classroom's a kind of protected and kind of sacred space, and obviously there's always like FERPA concerns, right? But so I prefer to use platforms where anonymity is possible. So if a student does have a privacy concern, they could have an anonymous account and still participate very actively. There's a lot of thinking about, like, how does in particular, what does FERPA mean for classrooms that want to be really public and doing stuff on social? And so, Facebook, for example, I don't use it as a classroom tool because it is so personal. And, by the terms of service are that you can't have, you have to have real names. So, whereas Twitter and Instagram, you can, be who you want.